Okay, so we're continuing with Butter's essay, Aesthetics as Metaphysical Meaning Making in the Face of Death. So I think I just hit the 15-minute mark, so I may have been cut off there. But yeah, we were covering the Butter's subchapter, Embodied Perception and Disrupted Intentionality, with the lymphoma patient named Marty, who was 60 years old, who had heard this piece of music, Eternal Memory, whereby when he heard it, he was offered a sense of safety. He recounts that he had this, when he heard the music, he felt he could either be cured or saved by God. And so the music brought him to this realization, and that's one way we could start thinking of this idea of consolation, and likewise metaphysical meaning making by way of perceptual experience, etc. Right? So, in other words, hereby we find the importance of perception. So, in other words, perception is understood as perceived in us, right? And then so Butters cites the 20th century French phenomenologist Maurice Merleau-Ponty, who placed emphasis on the entwined experience between subject and object. So the interdependence of the subjective and the objective. So that can't be overemphasized, right? So it's not just about this, phenomenology is not just about a first person account. Yes, that's important. But what's also important is the way in which we understand objective reality as well, right? And so that's key because objective reality is the very real fact of mortality itself. So then we have the subjective account as it's working through the very objective points of mortality and disease as well. The disease's effect on the body, etc. Okay, so in other words, i.e. when we're sick, we do not perceive the objective world in the same way we do when we are healthy or when we are well. And so in other words, we might even say our thinking is clouded by the sickness, but the problem with that metaphor is that what we want to more think is that the way in which we're experiencing things is informed by our sickness and informed by our mortality and our facing of mortality when we have diseases that are causing us to think differently and consider the world in a different way, right? So in other words, we have this key word here that's could be really confusing, that is intentionality. And so intentionality, as Butters describes it, is explaining the human positioning in the world. So we're always positioned toward something. So in other words, intentionality has to do with consciousness of something. So in other words, consciousness for a phenomenologist is never understood as consciousness in and of itself, but rather consciousness of something, okay? And then so, in other words, it's consciousness of something, someone, some idea, etc. And in this case, consciousness of an aesthetic experience as it's understood by a dying patient, right? So in other words, we should never mistake intentionality as meaning intending to do something as an aim or a goal. We should rather see it as the idea that intentionality captures the how, or the experiential and the qualitative way in which we are conscious of the world, okay? So death and dying as lived experience intensifies such intentionality of death, and so the intentionality of mortality then is heightened when we have these physical experiences of pain and suffering, right? So intentionality of an act is also operative. Oh, and she also draws a distinction between intentionality of an act and operative intentionality. So in other words, intentionality of an act is thinking surrounding everyday positions, attitudes about the world. So in other words, just about how it is that we're thinking about everyday things. And then operative intentionality, or otherwise known as functional intentionality, is the understanding that we have an embodied, non-representational, and preconceptual, indeed phenomenological understanding of the world, as known by our bodyal engagement with the world. So we are conscious of things by way of bodies in space as experiencing the world, etc. Okay, so that's operative intentionality. So then she also has the subchapter titled Rhythm and Meditation on Beauty. So in other words, we're placing an emphasis on the interrelational again. So Butters offers the example of Helena, who was a 45-year-old patient who was dying of breast cancer, who was also interested in aesthetics, where she viewed aesthetics to look at nature's beauty as the salvation of salvation, whereby she could plunge into the visual details out of her window and the way she was experiencing nature. Although she wasn't a practicing Christian anymore, she still felt a strong metaphysical sense of the beyond, and then also a beyond the physical in her interactions with nature, in her aesthetic experience of nature. And so then we're taken to the importance of rhythm for the philosopher John Dewey, the pragmatist John Dewey, and the idea that rhythm is the universal scheme of existence, and it pervades all of the arts. So we could think of that also like with music. In other words, the idea that music also has a rhythmic, exemplifies rhythmic patterns, also is exemplary of rhythmic patterns we find in nature, right? Our heart beating, rainfall, so on and so forth. So then there's also a philosopher she mentions, Suzanne Langer, who has the notion of virtuality, the virtuality of art. So in other words, the quality of all things that are created to be perceived. So in other words, art is also something that is created to be perceived, and the way in which we experience it is something that we understand perceptually with our bodies as a space that is virtual for Langer, right? So in other words, we also have the example of Dewey showing us that imagination is a way of bringing together the strange and the new with the familiar as a meeting of the mind and the universe. So what's also playing a part in our aesthetic experience there, according to Butters, for Dewey, obviously Suzanne Langer, is the importance of imagination, right? So imagination is the way that we have adventurous thinking. So in other words, adventurous thinking is drawing new connections, bringing the strange and new with the familiar as a meeting of the mind in the universe. We could think of that as an adventure and indeed an aesthetic adventure of the imagination, right? And so with Butters' subchapter, Art as Revelation, we have Art as Revelation, the meaning of aesthetic experience. She brings up Sartre, whereby we have the difference between being for itself and being in itself. So in other words, being is projected into the world as connected to the world that is not our personal being. In other words, the subjective must always meet with the objective. In other words, being for the world is, or being for itself is this idea that we have to also recognize that we're not the only ones in the world, and likewise the world moves on without us as well. And so that recognition of the otherness of the world that we're projecting into is a way that we understand being for itself in the example of the philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre, right? So in other words, we have a way of understanding ourselves, but we also have a way of understanding that there's an existence that goes beyond our existence. And so art is a way, art and artistic expression and aesthetic evaluation and experience take us beyond ourselves into something that is larger than ourselves, whether that be of people or the larger universe as a whole. So we have the example of Oiva, the 70-year-old cancer patient whose son is, he had this experience that he was telling Butters about, whereby they went to go pick up his wife's ashes after she had passed away with his son, and he had this vision of his son carrying his mother's ashes, whereby he remembered the mother carrying the son when the son was a baby. And so there was this temporal connection, and likewise an experience of memory that was brought about for Oiva that helped him have consolation, and aesthetic consolation with his own experience of hospice care and his situation with the onset of cancer and etc. Right? So, in other words, he also then drew a picture of this, and this is how he was able to then come to terms with how it is that he understood something subjectively in relation to the objective reality of his own mortality, would be a good way of putting that, right? So art becomes, as Langer had it, art becomes something that is virtual. In other words, it becomes the as-if of subjectivity. In other words, it's the as-if that meets with objective reality in the way that we experience the aesthetic experience, and likewise art itself, so art objects as well. So in other words, the virtual is experienced as what is possible beyond the confines of what is physical. So what is possible as beyond the confines of the physical is something that a dying patient can recognize, and also this recognition could bring about phenomenologically aesthetic experience that consoles the patient by way of metaphysics, or a metaphysical way of going beyond their own mortality to see something that is greater than just their experience as well, right? Okay, so I think that should take us to the end of the Butters paper, and we'll talk more about it and take it from there, okay? So thanks.